Hello, welcome back to week 3 of Wk.3. This is going to be the first of two brief clips that we're going to do for this week. The first clip, which you're going to obviously be doing right now, is going to revisit some of the quantitative work that we did last time, just to make sure that since you've had a week right now to review it, that things are clear. And then we'll talk a little bit about the next chapter, which is chapter 4. The second clip we'll talk about chapter 5, and I have to make certain special remarks about that, but we'll leave it until later on. So for the time being, therefore, I want to revisit that issue of the effect of wages, as we spoke about last time, because up until now the model has been presented without any money. And many of the, I guess, younger people in particular, or the ones that are new to trade, have often objected, said, what happens once money is in? And to use the same figures that we used last time, as you can see, just as a quick refresher, we spoke of two countries, Portugal and England, that produce wine and cloth. The thing that is clearly important for this to work is that a country is going to export that commodity which it can produce less expensively than another country, right? So if in this particular case the UK is going to, England let's say, is going to export cloth, then we're saying that cloth is less expensive in England than it is in Portugal. The reverse is true when it comes to wine, because remember the two countries have got to specialize. And it's going to be 100% specialization. So all the cloth is going to be produced by the Brits, and all the wine is going to be produced by the Portuguese. Now, as you all well know, this is a general principle that is going to be expected to be true. We will get a chance probably later on in this semester to talk a little bit more about it, but for the time being, I just want to stress the fact that probably all of you are aware of, is that what happens to the price of a commodity in a country that's going to export that commodity. A commodity is going to be exported, which means that it's going to become scarcer in the country that is exporting it, right? While the country that's importing it, it's going to become more abundant. So the prices in the country that are doing the exports are going to rise, and the prices in the countries that are going to do the imports are going to drop, until eventually it's the same price between the two countries. So really, in essence, one thing that we're going to talk about next week, because it'll become a little bit clearer, is that really trade is saying that two countries, or the world for that matter, will keep on trading until that window of opportunity is closed. When does the window of opportunity of trade closes? When the prices all over the world are the same. When the prices are the same, there's no longer you cannot trade. There is no rationale for trade. So for trade to take place, we spoke of the fact that you must have an advantage, right? Either an absolute in Smith, and obviously a comparative advantage, which means that this must be less expensive in the UK, while this must be less expensive in Portugal. Now, how can this be less expensive than it is over here? This is 1 hour and this is 10 hours. What if every British labourer makes $20 an hour and every Portuguese labourer makes only $1 an hour? So in that case, this will be 20 and this will be 10. Would you be able then to export? And the answer is no. So remember the important conclusion that you arrived at last time by working out these particular figures. Just to remind you, we said that where shall I put it? Let me put it here. That the wages in Portugal over the wages in England are going to be greater than 10%, but are going to be less than 4 times as much. So there is a range within which the wages in Portugal vis-a-vis those in England can change, but they cannot be outside of this range. Now, just in case you're not convinced of this, let's just try one example. Let's just take an example whereby the wage in Portugal over the wage in England is 5. That's to say, it's 5 times as much. Would we be able to have trade then? My obvious answer is no, but let's just work out an exact problem. Let's assume that the wage in England, just for the sake of the argument, is 10. I don't know, 10 sterlings, 10 pounds, 10 euros, whatever. It's 10. So how much would a jug of wine cost in England? It's going to cost 10 times, you remember, 8 hours, so this is 10 per hour, so it's going to be 80. If Portuguese labor is getting 5 times as much, then how much it's getting? It's getting 50. 50 times 2 is 100. Can you trade? No. Because remember, the flows that we're talking about are expected, are based on the fact that those in Portugal are less expensive, the wine, than it is in England. So definitely when it's 5, which is outside of this limit, it doesn't work. Take a figure that is in between in order to show that this range makes sense. What if this wage rate ratio is, say, for the sake of the argument, 2? If it's 2, what happens to these rates? Well, let's leave the British rate at 10. So the price per wine is going to be 80. If the Portuguese make twice as much, then what's going to be the price of wine in Portugal? Then the wage rate is going to be 20. We need 2 hours for every jug of wine. So 20 times 2, that will be 40. Can they trade? Yes, because we expect this to be less expensive in Portugal than it is in England. The reverse is true, by the way. If you go ahead and you look at the wine, at the cloth, it'll be also the same thing. The British wine, the British cloth must be less expensive than the cloth in Portugal, otherwise England would not be able to export it. So what we're saying really is that it isn't sufficient, once you introduce money and wages, to look only at these physical conditions. That is what the theory is predicated upon, but what we're saying is that if we are to introduce a wage rate that is not compatible with this theory, then there won't be any trade. Because then the cost will no longer be what is required in order to have this flow of merchandise. That's to say, the British, in this case, in order for them to export cloth, the wage rate in Portugal to the wage rate in England must never be less than 1/10. Because if it's less than 1/10, by the way, what's going to happen? Well, I'm sure that you figured it out. That's why I stopped for a second. Because if this is less than 1/10, then the cost of cloth in Portugal will become lower than it is in England. And therefore the British will not be able to go ahead and export it. So you remember the details about how to work out these particular limits. But even if you don't, by the way, remember the details, and I think you should, and you should master it, but you can look at from here. It's really derived from here, because remember, I mean, we use these figures to arrive at that particular limit, right? The limit over here, obviously, is that in cloth it must be less than, greater than 1/10, and over here it must be less than 4 times. The 2 over 8 is the, or the 8 over 2 is the 4, and over here the 1 over the 10 is the 10th. So the demands of labor then can act in such a way as to mess up the opportunities for a particular country to go ahead and export a particular product, although it enjoys an advantage when measured only in labor hours. Okay? Now the next thing that we're going to discuss for the sake of today's article, today's session, is very similar to this, but we won't right now, and I'm not going to use the board. Maybe I'll just jot down a couple of things on the board. The argument is that international trade seems to be, okay, the classical theory of international trade, right? As we all know, based on what we have said so far, not only today, but in the last 2 sessions also, what is clear is the fact that we are saying that international trade theory, the classical international trade theory, because we haven't moved beyond the classical yet, is a theory that seems to be very accurate. We are very much believers in it. It is elegant, it's mathematical, people have been trying to show that it doesn't work forever, but nobody has been able to show that. And so why is it therefore that we have all that controversy? As I hope you all know, not only in the United States, but all over the world, but if we're going to limit ourselves to the United States, whenever there is a presidential election, one of the major platforms, or planks in that platform of the presidential race, is the issue of international trade. This has been so for the last, I know, 20, 30, 40 presidential elections. It's always a huge issue. Now, this isn't the place to go ahead and discuss at length the problems connected, let's assume, to NAFTA or whatever it is. As time goes on, and once we get a chance, we'll be able to say a little bit about them. But what is important is the fact that this classical theory is not held by everyone to be absolutely true. There are many people that seem to be opposed to it. And the question is, therefore, what are we to believe? Why is it that there are so many people that are opposed to it? Well, the simple answer of the matter really, which is a superficial response, is that mercantilism probably is not dead. Remember, mercantilism is regulation. And there are many people in the United States, both in the Senate and in the House, that would love to be able to build walls around the United States. Let's say they are protectionists. They believe in regulation. They don't believe in free international trade. They think that free international trade really doesn't work. And they would love to go back to mercantilism. But outside of that, there must be something else. What are the major 2 things? Well, to simplify things, let's just look at the 2 extremes. So we have on one side, one group that is supporting trade, and we have another group that is anti-trade. Why is it that they arrive at these conclusions? Well, the first thing, as you might imagine, we have really alluded to it a couple of times, is that the group that supports trade, and most of these textbooks, by the way, and theories, are people that support trade, because they're presenting the classical trade model with its benefits. Sometimes they are a little bit critical. But what they're saying is that the models have been tested over and over and over again, and they've always turned out to be accurate. Nobody has up until now shown that there is any internal consistency in these models. Because any model that has internal consistencies is going to self-destruct. And they're saying that these models do not have any internal consistency if you are to believe in their axioms. They are built on certain presuppositions, on some assumptions. If you still recall, and we discussed all of these assumptions before, right? So considering all of these assumptions, we are led to certain expectations. And they say, wait a minute, let's go ahead and look at the expectations vis-a-vis reality. And they do admit, they do not deny it, that reality is often quite different than what the models are predicting, or could be different. And so, what's their conclusion then? Well, they say the models are accurate. It is the infrastructure that we have built. That's to say, the policies that we have adopted, the type of governance that we are using, that is imperfect. It's not the theory that is wrong. What is wrong is the way that we are implementing it. So there is an imperfection as far as these institutions that we have. And the failure, therefore, is not a failure of theory, but it's a failure of policy. And that's why, for example, one of the most important periodicals in economics is The Economist, right? The British magazine, The Economist. This was started and is still up until now driven by only one thing: to promote free international trade. Because they believe that it is totally true, the theory. All what you have to do is to adopt the policies. And they argue, by the way, by suggesting, not only the economists, I mean those that are in support of this theory, that the world has never really practiced free international trade. We talk about it, but we never practice it. I mean, even if you go back to Smith, 250 years ago, you'll find out, and if we get a chance later on when we spend some more time on history, if the time allows, that we really have practiced international trade for only a very short period of time towards the end of the 1800s, of the 19th century, that is. So it's not enough to say that we are teaching trade, that we believe in trade. We must set up the institutions that are going to be required in order for trade to work. And that is not so. Therefore, they maintain the belief that the trade theory is accurate, but they think that we've got to go ahead and develop better institutions. Now, the other group is almost 180-degree opposite. Now, believe it or not, they cannot show that technically the theory is wrong. Because, as I said, this is, by the way, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why is it that there's a Nobel Prize in economics. There isn't a Nobel Prize in very many other fields of social sciences, but there is one in economics, because it's viewed as if it's a science. It is elegant, it's mathematical, it leads to a conclusion. If you accept the axioms, you cannot refute the conclusion. That's the thing about everything in mainstream economics, not only international trade. So let me warn you from right now that if you are to be one of the people that wants to go ahead and be critical, and you're more than free to be critical of it. As I said before, if the time permits, I am normally also very critical of very many aspects of international trade. But if you're going to be critical, then you cannot accept the assumptions, the presuppositions. Once you accept the presuppositions, then you have painted yourself into a corner and you must accept its conclusions. So these people, the anti-trade people, what they really say, they say that the theory is wrong because it is built on a fiction. They can't show that the theory itself is wrong. They're saying that the theory is built on certain assumptions that are not true. So it doesn't do me any good to have a theory that is built on fictitious assumptions. And for them the proof is very simple. You look at the results of the world and you find out that really the benefits from trade have not been as large as the model would have predicted, and don't always work according to the models, and you find out that certain countries actually can claim to be injured even by trade. Their defense is a simple one, that all of these assumptions, I'm not going to remind you of all of them, just don't exist. What is one of the single most important assumptions for free trade? Is not to have any barriers. Can anyone name many things or major things whereby there are no barriers? Can we import in the United States? And again, I don't want to put the cart in front of the horse, but it's difficult sometimes not to mention these things. Can we import all the steel that we want in the United States? Can you import all the cars that you want to in, say, Egypt or India, for that matter? Or China? No. There are limits on practically every single commodity that you can think of. So we don't have we don't have a world without any barriers. So to go ahead and build a model then that assumes that there are no barriers is really a fiction. What are some of the other major assumptions that are totally violated? Remember, one of the most important assumptions for the classical model, not only for trade, but everything in economics, is built on the assumption of, as I hope, giving you a couple of seconds to think about it, perfect competition. And when was the last time that you saw perfect competition anywhere in the world? Not only in the United States. Is there perfect competition in the, production of cell phones? Is there any perfect competition in searching the internet? I mean, just the mere fact that these companies are making huge profits means that they are really printing money, which means that they're not perfectly competitive. Because as probably all of us know, and we mentioned it last time just en passant, that in perfect competition there are no economic profits. Nobody is supposed to make any pure economic profits. There are only normal profits. So whenever you have a corporation that's making oodles of money, then by definition the world is not perfectly competitive. What about the prices? Well, again, we referred to it before, but if you still recall, that in a world that is perfectly competitive, for the price to be realistic, to be actual, to be meaningful, to be the real price, then you must not have any externalities. But the world is full of externalities. There isn't a single price probably that includes the cost of cleaning up the externalities, the byproduct of that particular activity. So one can argue that most of the prices, maybe even all the prices that we see, are actually fictitious. And so on and so on. So really their point, therefore, is that yes, the model is mathematically viable. Geometrically it works beautifully, as we have seen. You can do the calculation and find out how many hours you're going to benefit and how many hours and how is it that you're going to divide these benefits. But this has nothing to do with reality. Reality is completely different because none of these assumptions is ever met. So when you're faced with such a problem, a challenge, whereby you have two major groups, each of them is advocating something that is totally different than the other, what do you do? Well, we try then to do a test, a quantitative test, right? And this is really the essence of this chapter. How do we test? In this particular case, like you do in most social sciences, you go ahead and you collect the data and you subject it to some form of an examination, right? I mean, if I'm going to make a statement saying that all the students who get A's are those who study 4 hours a week per credit, then it should be very simple for me to go ahead and substantiate that by doing a survey, and I'll find out who are the students that study 4 hours a week per credit. So a 3-credit course will require 12 hours a week of study, and I'll find out if each of them got an A. And then if I'll find out that all the other students that did not study 12 hours a week for this particular course wound up with, let's assume, a B or a C or even a B minus. If I can find a very strict correlation between the grades and the number of hours studied, then I would have proven my theory, so to speak. So in this case, we're saying that there is a gentleman, a British gentleman, by the name of McDougal, and the name is spelled out in the book, but just to put the initials over here. McDougal did such a study, at least that was his intention. And the important thing, or at least some of the important things to remember, is that the study was done in 1951. So as you can see, we're really referring to something that took place a long, long time ago. The data, to make it even worse, the data was that based on data of 1939, which definitely was a completely different world than what it is right now. However, what is important right now is to note that this particular study has been updated by a number of people, more than once. Some have found some slight contradictions, but most of the studies that have been done seem to support the results of McDougal. And that's why in your textbook and in all other introductory textbooks, it's still used up until now as the proof of a study that the classical theory of international trade works. Now, what did McDougal do? Just to make sure that everybody understands this. What McDougal did is that he looked at the major 2 countries in the world, UK and the US at the time, right? He said, okay, what does trade tell us about when these two countries, the flow of goods between these two countries. What is important is to note, as we have just done earlier, that the country that can produce a particular item at a lower price than the other country is the country that's going to dominate exports. By the way, we used this expression before, but just in case some of you have really forgotten, in macroeconomics, normally X is for exports and M is for imports. And so we'll maintain that, and towards the end of the semester, we'll try to build a macroeconomic model if we get a chance using the X's and the M's. So if this international trade theory is to work, then these commodities whereby the United States has lower prices, they must dominate those of England. Well, exactly the opposite. Whenever the UK produces something that has lower prices than the US, then it must dominate the exports. So what did he do, McDougal? Well, obviously he couldn't have studied, a million different commodities. So he looked at 25 industries. He collected information based on 25 industries, both in the UK and in the US. One of his, without getting into very many of the great details, because these small details can become really a little bit more complicated, but the message is very simple. He found out that overall, the wages in the US, remember what we just spoke about earlier, wages in Portugal vis-a-vis in England? He found out that the wages in the US vis-a-vis the UK, in the US they are twice as high. So US wages are double those in the UK. So go back to that question of hours then. If the US wage is twice as high as that in the UK, when would the US be in a position to export its goods? When its labor productivity is more than twice as high, right? If I'm being paid twice as high as you are, for me to have an advantage over you in the production of a particular commodity, I must be able to have a productivity that is more than twice as high as yours, otherwise I wouldn't be at an advantage, right? The bottom line is that you take the 25 industries, you look at the fact that American wages are twice as high, then you need to look therefore at what? At the question of productivity. He compiled the productivities and he found out that whenever the productivity in the United States is above 2, vis-a-vis England that is, then American exporters seem to be dominant. But whenever the productivity of US labor was less than twice that of the UK, then the UK export tend to be the dominant one, which is exactly what the theory would have predicted. And what is even more interesting is that there wasn't a single group out of the 25 that did not work according to the expectation of the theory. So whenever the US exports of a commodity tend to dominate those of the UK, the US productivity was more than twice as high. And whenever the US productivity was not twice as high, the UK tended to dominate exports in that particular productivity. So it can be taken, therefore, on surface value as being 100% in support of the classical theory. which is true, but you'll find out that there are people that have pointed out to certain methodological shortcomings. And you're free to believe in them or not, but you should know what they are, the methodological shortcomings. The first thing, by the way, that is the most obvious, is that this trade theory that we spoke about, remember we said Portugal vis-a-vis England, or US vis-a-vis Japan, or one half of the world vis-a-vis the other half of the world. That's to say, we talk about exports and imports from one country to the other country. In this case, what did McDougal do? We looked at the 25 different industry groups and the exports of the US and the UK, but not to each other. We looked at the US exports to the rest of the world and the UK exports to the rest of the world. So very many people looked at this as being sort of a violation of sorts of the theory, and so they were not satisfied that this by itself really is of a sufficient proof. The other methodological argument that is used against the McDougal study is the fact that when you do such a quantitative analysis and you find out that the outcome does not contradict this particular model, does that mean that there is no other model that could have the same outcome? What if there is another model, or another maybe 4 or 5 different models? So the fact that this one is correct does not mean that there are no other models that would have predicted the same thing. So some people also took this as a relative sign of weakness. The third sign of weakness, which again is probably very obvious, is that the model did not control, all of these quantitative models, as well as you know, must control for different variables. So in this case, this model did not control for certain other variables that are very important for the functioning of this model. What would be such variables? The cost of transportation. What if the US, for example, for the sake of the argument, is going to have an advantage over the UK per unit, let's assume to the tune of $5, but the country that we're looking at, the exports to a particular country, that country is very close to the UK, and the US needs to spend $10 in order to export that particular good. So it loses its advantage. So it did not control for the cost of transportation. It did not control also for certain other barriers. What if a particular country has certain preferable treatments for British goods vis-a-vis American goods? What if they have a completely different policy for political reasons that favor one country vis-a-vis the other? So there's a number of issues that the study did not control. However, the bottom line is that yes, you can argue both ways, but the real strong argument, I think, and you've got to, however, recognize the flaws, is that the flows of trade in the world seem to be almost totally identical to what the classical trade theory would have predicted. And we don't want to get into more greater details right now, because we're gonna do one more thing next week, which will be the last step of evolution in the model. So you remember we started with mercantilist, you get Smith, absolute advantage, you get Ricardo. There are questions that Smith was not able to answer. There are questions that Ricardo was not able to answer. So we'll introduce the last step, which will be Heckscher-Ohlin next week. And then we'll be able to probably discuss trade or show that with all these modifications, the essence of the model is still the classical trade theory. Most of the other modifications are very simple ideas to tune it, to make it a little bit more realistic. But the heart of it is still Ricardo. And that's why, as I might have mentioned already, The Economist and very many others are built on the fact, on the assumption that trade theory is the most beneficial for economic development between nations if we play the game right. So with this, I will let you go, and I will prepare after a while the second segment for week 3, which will be on a slightly, not only slightly, but really a completely different kind of an issue. But we need that as an introduction so that we'll be able to do the Heckscher-Ohlin during week 4. Okay, bye-bye.